okay, we are not able to even pay 20, but we are able to steal 90 and there's no discussion about it. I think that's scandalous, actually. You could have afforded that food. You could have paid your rent. You could have paid your electricity bill if this extremely rich people actually pay their taxes. Welcome to the third series of System Shift, a podcast from Greenpeace which explores how we can move from a world that serves the economy to an economy that works for people and the planet. In our previous series, we looked at alternatives to our current failing economic and financial systems. The theme of this series is change. Can it happen in our lifetime? I'm Carl Schlyter, and I'm your host in the two earlier seasons. And speaking of change, in this series, I'll be joined by two additional hosts. I'm so excited to be able to introduce them to you. Please welcome Joycelyn Longdon and Yewande Omotoso.
Thank you, Carl. It's great to be here. Great to be on the show with yourself and with Joycelyn. And I'm really looking forward to the conversations we're going to have.
Thanks, Carl. Thanks for welcoming us to host this podcast alongside you. It's really exciting. I'm really looking forward to working with you and Yewande.
Yes, I'm so happy you're here, both of you. Before we get started on this first episode, why don't you both take a chance to tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, of course. I'm Joycelyn. I am an environmental justice technologist, writer, and educator. I'm currently completing my doctoral studies, looking at the environmental justice implications of conservation technologies like bioacoustics, which you can think of like Shazam for nature. And I work to communicate accessible resources online and in real life with my platform Climate in Colour at the intersection of climate justice and climate tech. And in April, my first book, Natural Connection, will be released with Penguin Vintage. And this book is all about the legacy of people of colour and indigenous communities in the environmental justice movement and the change that they have made and how this can inspire our connection with the natural world.
And I'm Yewande. I'm a writer of 3 published novels and I work with storytelling at Greenpeace. I really believe in the power of story and the role stories play in the change we want to see in the world. And so it's wonderful to join this podcast where really we're going to be listening to stories from around the world and stories of how change can and is happening.
That's so exciting, actually, because storytelling has been for thousands of years the way we have communicated learnings and teachings about how we should live as humans. And Joycelyn, I think it's quite interesting. When I studied chemical engineering, I wanted to be an environmental engineer, and they said, oh, that's just hippies. That doesn't exist. But the year after, they actually introduced it after our complaint. So welcome, both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For this episode, we're asking the question, would the world change if we taxed the super rich, and how?
We'll be looking at taxes and how wealth tax could drive significant social and environmental change, as well as funding climate adaptation practices whilst addressing economic inequality. So we put a poll on our Instagram page where we asked, do you think raising taxes on the rich would help solve your country's environmental and social problems? Carl, do you have any guesses about what people's responses were?
It's difficult to guess, but my heart and brain tells me that people are more sensible than their leaders on these issues.
Yep, you would be correct. Overwhelmingly, people agreed that raising taxes on the rich would help solve environmental and social problems, with 60% voting yes, 24% voted in the middle, said maybe, and 16% said no.
We also asked how to get the super rich to pay their fair share of taxes. And here's what some of you had to say.
Stop all the loopholes and punish them with imprisonment if they commit fraud.
Have a global treaty.
The tax system should be based on equity, not equality.
Tax the super rich to use the money for environmental protection and restoration.
This episode is incredibly interesting and very poignant, as recently there have been a lot more conversations and public demand for a wealth tax. And this comes with the understanding that those who are wealthier contribute more to the climate and biodiversity crises. And also that these crises need a substantial amount of funding so that we can achieve social and environmental win-win outcomes. So today we're going to be speaking about what a wealth tax is, the complexities of implementing wealth tax, what wealth tax looks like between the global north and the global south, and how we can rethink our economic systems and the ways that we redistribute wealth.
In this episode, we're joined by Chenai Mukumba, Executive Director of the Tax Justice Network Africa. Chenai has worked in the non-profit sector for over 15 years in Asia and Africa and has expertise in international trade and Africa's economic governance, with experience in research coordination, policy advocacy, and leadership development.
Thank you so much, Chenai, for being with us today. We've been asking our guests to help us learn a phrase about sustainability, or just a phrase that is your favorite phrase in your mother tongue or in the language of where you're from. So I don't know if you have a phrase that you'd like to share with us and teach us to say before we get into the full interview.
Yeah, sure. So I am Zimbabwean, and my mother tongue is Shona, which also is, I guess, my cultural group. And I think if I was to think of one saying, what comes to mind immediately would be Chanda Chimwe Achitswanyi Inda, which literally means one finger cannot squash lice, for lack of interpretation. But really what it tried to speak to is the fact that you need collective efforts in order to make change. So I think when thinking about this topic, that's the sort of proverb in my mother tongue that comes to mind.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. It would be good to start just to really get an idea of what exactly a wealth tax is, how it works, and how it can be a tool for redistributing resources.
Okay. So, I mean, a wealth tax tries to take advantage of one of the functions of taxation, right? So when thinking about tax, a lot of people only really think about the revenue raising function of tax, right? And so this is the ability of sort of taxes to contribute to sort of the financial resources that are required to fund whatever objectives a government sets out. But tax has a number of different functions that we like to call the 4, or now increasingly the 5 R's of taxation. So revenue raising is one, redistribution is another, repricing is the other, representation is the other, and then sort of reparations is an increasing function of tax that's being explored these days. And so when thinking about wealth tax, you're really trying to see the way in which you can sort of bring forward the redistributive function of tax, right? So looking at particularly wealthier individuals, the either income or wealth that they have, and trying to see how you can use tax policy in order to, in a sense, capture some of that wealth and then redistribute it within an economy or a society in order to have that wealth serve sort of a larger societal objective.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. It's really, tax can seem like such a overwhelming topic and something that feels like unfamiliar or really technical to people. So it's really great to just get down into the nitty-gritty of what exactly it means. And I think one of the misconceptions too is or misunderstandings is the difference between the wealth and an income tax. So I don't know if you would be able to elaborate on the specific differences between those two different types of tax.
So I think the wealth is essentially what one could say is the already existing resources, right, that one has. Whereas income, on the other hand, is sort of something that is continuously sort of generating itself, right? So at an individual level, if you have a job, you have an income that you're earning on a monthly basis, right? And there's a number of different ways that one can earn this income. Whereas wealth, so to speak, is this asset that one already has. Wealth can also generate income, right? But really, it's already it's an already existing sort of amount that you have at your disposal.
So a wealth tax can be, for example, on the capital you have or on property that you own and the value of it, and you tax it every year. And another thing is then the capital gains tax, where you make profit from the capital you have, and then you can pay a profit tax on that. So that's kind of different sorts of wealth taxes.
Exactly. So a wealth tax, for example, would be an inheritance tax, right? So, for example, say you've received a large amount of money from perhaps a family member or somebody that's passed away, and then a taxation on that that you've just received is another type of wealth tax.
A common argument against that is people say, it's already paid for. Why should I pay tax twice on the same money? Can you explain the argument why an inheritance tax would be justified?
I mean, it's a question around incidence, right? So who paid that tax, right? And so in a sense, when we're making the case for why the recipient of inheritance should pay tax is because, in a sense, the recipient themselves haven't, in a sense, paid their tax on what they're about to benefit from.
And also, like the legacy, would you really, if you had zero inheritance tax, you would probably have such a concentration of wealth after a few generations. So you would also have maybe other negative aspects on society based on inequality and concentration of power and wealth. Could that be also an argument?
Absolutely. I think there's a lot of research that's been done that shows what the negative impacts of having a high concentration of wealth within sort of a small group of individuals looks like. And I mean, this looks like, for example, the undermined trust in institutions, because if you've got greater wealth, you're more likely to have influence, political influence, right, into institutions, into media, etc. I think it also contributes, in a sense, to increased inequality within an economy, within a society, which then has the ripple effects of social unrest, for example, which is something that we've been seeing a lot of in the African continent. So absolutely, I think that high concentration of resources within the hands of a few definitely has negative impacts in a society.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I think these are some of the things that people maybe don't think about when they're kind of talking about these arguments. And another argument that people have sort of against these wealth taxes is about investment being removed. I mean, you mentioned that these individuals have a huge amount of political influence, but also business influence. And there's this assumption that you cannot touch the wealth of the rich because they will, move their money elsewhere, which would bring a negative social impact. Could you, speak about whether this assumption is valid and kind of explain how this works or how you've seen it play out?
This is part of the reason why, when thinking about things like wealth tax, international tax cooperation is necessary, right? Because of what you've said, at times, particularly wealthy individuals, when I guess governments are trying to find a way to access that, they then start to think about moving their wealth, right? And this is often an argument that those that are anti-wealth taxes put forward. But if you look at the numbers, actually, whilst there often is some level of movement and shifting of wealth by individuals, it's not as significant as a lot of the naysayers like to put out, right? In fact, I think there's some research that was done by South Africa, I know, when they were thinking about wealth tax, that actually showed that, yes, there's going to be some movement, but it's negligible compared to what a country could benefit by actually putting that in place and therefore benefiting from that type of tax policy.
It's interesting how that can be similar through different jurisdictions, because from the total north of the globe then, Norway, they introduced or increased their wealth tax, and we saw some flight, but the net income of the tax actually increased significantly despite this. So there are rather few that want to uproot everything and leave only to avoid a small tax.
Yeah. And I think it's important. That's why podcasts like this are important, to make sure that that information is finding itself into the public domain, because then you tend to find a lot of policymakers are making decisions based off of that, right? Which is not accurate in terms of the implications and impact of wealth taxes.
Well, then I would like to go ahead and ask, if you want to introduce a wealth tax, the decision is most often national. And then we have just talked about how some people might try to avoid it. So what would be the countermeasure to that effect, so to speak?
So I know some countries are having conversations about putting what in a sense would almost be an exit tax, right? So if an individual decides that they want to shift their wealth outside of a country, put in place a tax that they would need to pay, right, for moving their resources from one jurisdiction to another, right? And so that's a type of measure that I know some countries are thinking about. But I think also very broadly when talking about international tax cooperation, this is also necessary because certain individuals may not try to do it in a way that's as transparent, right, and visible, particularly for governments to see. And so you want to be able then to engage and have interactions with other governments so that they're able to inform you if, for example, there is wealth that's being transferred to another jurisdiction, right, so that cooperation can then help them identify that movement.
Yeah, this is so interesting. And I think it's really interesting to also think about the dynamics between global north and global south, and specifically countries in Africa. And one thing that comes to mind is that a lot of the tax, when we're thinking about the climate crisis and adaptation and mitigation, needs to be coming from the wealthiest countries. And you were talking about the 5 R's of tax, with reparations being the 5th one. And so how do we ensure that the resources raised from wealth taxes in these wealthier nations would actually reach the most vulnerable, not just the most vulnerable countries, but also the most vulnerable within those countries as well?
So I think there's 2 points that I would make to this. I absolutely think that taxes reparations is important. I absolutely think that global north countries have a responsibility, I think, to pay for the implications of climate change, particularly on developing countries. I think for reasons that you've probably discussed on the podcast already, right? They're the main contributors, and we're seeing the most devastating impacts happening in developing countries. This is my first point. My second point is that's easier said than done. Right. And I think you only need to look at, recent efforts in this regard and how they failed. Right. So I think on my side, some of the thinking that we've been exploring is how can developing countries put measures in place that sort of have them in a slightly more proactive position when it comes to sort of climate financing. And that might look like crazy ideas, such as when exporting some of your minerals, right? What kind of tax rate do you want to put in place, right? For countries that need these minerals, so that you're maintaining that revenue within your country rather than sort of waiting on them to tax their individuals and then put in place a number of measures so that that money then finds itself within your borders, right? So I think on our side, we also need to think about ways to get that financing in a slightly more proactive way. But absolutely, that money needs to find itself from the global north and into the purses of global south countries.
And this really shows why tax policy needs to be integrated with trade policy, because the economic partnerships agreements between the European Union and Africa actually banned many of those export taxes that was a huge revenue for several governments. So this is really important, that we don't only change taxes here, but we have a look at they are not undermine the work we do here in trade policy. But I see that the African Union group of countries in the United Nations have made an excellent initiative to have a tax initiative. Could you tell us more about this?
Yeah. Before I go into that, I think just want to double click that you're completely right. I think tax policy is connected to every other type of policy that a government is putting in place. And you're absolutely right. Trade policy is one of those, right? I think a conversation that we were having recently as TGNA and some of our network members, right, was this idea that it's really important for us to think about what the developmental objective we want to achieve as a continent is, and then how does tax policy help contribute to that, right? And then, of course, that then has implications on, so from a trade taxes perspective, right, what do we need to be thinking about? So just to absolutely say that that's correct. And then I think with regards to your second question, which is another topic that I love talking about, is this conversation about a UN tax convention, right? And this is a conversation that started many, many years ago. But sort of in the recent history, we can see it dating back to about 2015, where the sort of high-level panel that was established in 2011 to sort of explore this topic of illicit financial flows and tax on the continent sort of put out as a recommendation in terms of how to address some of these issues that are undermining African countries' ability to raise resources. So this panel flagged that, African countries are losing resources due to, a number of loopholes that exist in some of our domestic policies, due to lack of coordination at regional level, but also due to this sort of very disparate framework that exists at the global level, right? That's allowing multinational corporations and, relevant to this conversation, wealthy individuals, right, to exploit loopholes and move money around. So what we saw in 2022 was a proposal that was tabled by the Africa group, specifically Nigeria, did the tabling on behalf of that group of countries to say we feel that this conversation about a global tax system that works for everybody, that's cognizant of varying countries' contexts, needs to happen at the UN, where every single country has a seat at the table.
Yeah, just for viewers who might not be familiar with that, like the World Bank and the IMF is working a little bit like a corporation and is voting. The large, rich nations have a lot more votes, and therefore a tax reform within the UN framework with one country, one vote would be an extremely much more fair way to do a tax reform. So that's what we are talking about here.
Just to your point, I think we've got colleagues that say within the IMF and the World Bank, it's $1, one vote, right? So the more money you bring into that space, the more say you have, which really sort of undermines these democratic principles, right, that we like to say are essential for us to really sort of govern, right, ourselves effectively. So at the UN, whilst of course there are still sort of asymmetries of power, quite frankly, it's one of the most, I would say, democratic spaces, right, where regardless of size of country, your voice can count as the same as even, say, for example, the United States.
Yeah, and we've been kind of touching on this idea that it's beyond an individual wealth tax, right? There is a lot of complicated interactions going on here between individuals, governments, and also corporations. And I think it'd be interesting just to expand on the role of wealth tax as it pertains to corporations and how do they affect each other?
So I think with corporations or multinational corporations and sort of wealthy individuals, I think we see them sort of use very similar mechanisms, right, to avoid paying taxes where they reside, right? So we often sort of lump them together, right, when thinking about the way governments need to have policies in place to avoid them from both illegally and illicitly sort of shifting sort of their taxes from one jurisdiction to often a low tax jurisdiction. And so I think for us, the reason we think of them collectively is because at the end of the day, when thinking about progressive tax systems, we have this notion that those who earn the most pay the most, right? Institutions and individuals with higher taxable capacities should be those that are contributing more to government purses, right? So it's particularly that sort of group of individuals and companies, right, that we feel need to be targeted specifically to make sure that you don't have an unfair burden of taxes being carried by ordinary citizens or even at times marginalized citizens because of the implementation of sort of regressive tax policies such as VAT, for example.
But then, I mean, there are many figures floating around, but one quoted figure is $500 billion a year is lost in tax avoidance, and that's mostly done by really rich individuals and corporations. So that's actually a lot more than the total biodiversity and climate funding the United Nations is talking about. So how could you actually tackle tax avoidance? Would this new tax treaty help us doing that, and how?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, within the African continent, the figures that I like to quote quite often is that we're losing close to $90 billion annually. But when you take a look at, for example, the amount that we receive in ODA, right, we're losing almost double that. Right. So I always find it an interesting statistic, right, to say if you were to help African countries not lose their own resources, we actually almost wouldn't even need development assistance from Global North countries. Right. And I hope that sort of helps bring all of this into perspective. But then the conversation about the UN Tax Convention, I think that the point I'd made earlier is that we currently have a setup at the OECD where it's a small group of rich countries that are making decisions on behalf of everybody. Right. Yeah. And these countries have very limited contextual understandings and appreciation, right, of the situation of many developing countries. And so these rules are put in place and can't be implemented by developing countries. And because they can't, it really undermines their ability to address, right, this loss of revenue that's happening. So our hope, our expectation, right, is that by shifting the platform where these rules are discussed and decided to the UN, you have countries even as small as Lesotho, right, contribute to the rulemaking so that what's agreed is something that even they can apply and hopefully, right, much more meaningfully address this issue in a way that they're able to implement as well.
And one question that always comes up to me when thinking about how hard we're finding it to just rally up the funds that are needed is also, once, say, we do get those funds, how should implementation be conducted on the ground? Do we have a clear idea of how these taxes, or whether it comes from tax or whether it comes from other means, how this can be deployed on the ground for the most use?
I think it would look, were it ever to find itself, I think within Global South countries, I think it would look different, right, in different countries. Because I think many countries are experiencing the devastating impacts of climate change in different ways, right? So, I mean, earlier this year we had both droughts and floods, right, on the continent. And so I think the way in which a country would deploy those resources would look very different. I think what we would need to make sure is that the process of the way in which these resources is used is done inclusively, right? Is done so that those communities that are being most negatively affected are part and parcel of that decision making, because they're the ones that are, suffering the brunt. And I think so I think principles around how those resources are going to be spent are what we need to be thinking about. And like I said, the actual outcome could look very different country by country.
The current system actually, first of all, it benefits those who have a short-term thinking on keeping their private wealth away from anybody else and the planet's needs. Then secondly, it benefits mostly Global North countries, and Global South countries are on the losing end of the stick. But then what would be the benefit for Global North governments to agree on a tax convention that would benefit anyone? What's kind of the argument that you could use if you live in the Global North to argue for you should support this initiative? What would you use as arguments that it would benefit those countries?
Well, first and foremost, this issue of loss of resources and revenues is not just a developing country thing. No. Developed countries are similarly losing significant amount of money, in fact, much more than developing countries. The reason we flag the impact it's having on developing countries is because for us, it's a larger percentage of our GDP, exactly, and the implications are much more significant, right? But the amounts that developed countries are losing are very, very large. And in the same way that I mentioned earlier, you see an undermining of institutions, a growing of inequality. These are all things that we're seeing, particularly in developed countries as well. And then I think the second point that I would make, I think we need to think about ourselves in a much more global community sense, right? The extent to which developing countries are able to advance, to become much more industrialized, has positive implications for all of us, right? So I know, for example, in developed countries, a big issue that currently I think a lot of politicians are needing to navigate is migration, right, of people particularly from Global South countries to Global North countries. The reason that's happening, right, is because Global South countries don't have the resources they need right now to invest in societies that are able to create job opportunities and all of that, right, for individuals that are located this side. So it's really to say the extent to which you can contribute to the betterment of Global South countries has positive impacts across the board, not just in those countries as well. And so that's why I think closing loopholes, ensuring that governments are adequately resourced to fund education, health, etc., has broader impacts, positive impacts for all of us.
So thank you, Chenai. I mean, it's been such an incredible conversation, and I mean, I'm learning so much, and I think people who are listening will be learning so much. And one thing I think people might be thinking is it's easy to see taxation as something beyond the individual, as in beyond everyday normal people. But I'd like you to just give us an idea of why we should be caring about this and why we should be thinking about this as individuals, as part of the way we think about systems change and the way that we think about shifting the system, and what agency we have in this as well?
That's a good question. One of my good friends at Tax Justice Network, Alex, he likes to say that tax is our superpower. It's a different twist, right, on how we think about tax, because very rarely do you talk about tax and it evoke positive emotions, right, when you're talking to people. But it really is that, in the sense that, I mean, right at the beginning of this, you asked me to think about, sort of a phrase in my local language that a single finger, cannot sort of kill a whole head of lice, right? I think tax really sort of brings that to life, in the sense that it's our collective power as individuals, right, to address so many of the societal issues that we have. I like to say about tax that here you literally start to see how the sum of our parts is bigger than the whole, right? Because as an individual, for example, to give a very practical example, you wouldn't be able to build a road, right, in order to get from point A to point B, right? As an individual, you can't assure sort of national security for yourself, right? You need to find a way to collate all of our resources to provide that type of service to each and every single one of us. And so I think about tax that way, right? I think about it being how we can together, right, put in one basket what we need to all benefit from. And this is not to say that the way it's being implemented across countries is perfect. Very few things, I think, in our societies are perfect. But it really is, I think, an important tool that we have within our box to address many of the issues that we're confronted with today.
And that, I would say, is also that it's good to have a tax reform, but what do you say about the fundamental underlying economic structure of current capitalism that actually actively pushes wealth upwards and upwards all the time?
Yep.
That creates a kind of countercurrent constantly that we need to fight against. What would you say could be some kind of reforms and solutions to this problem, the root cause?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and I think I'll probably be one of the first to tell you that this is actually one of the criticisms of sort of the tax justice movement, right? That we're doing this work after the fact, right? And unlike, for example, some of the other economic justice movements that are trying to sort of address this issue head on before it becomes one that we're trying to fix, we don't tend to sort of align with that. And these are conversations that I know the team here at TGNA are having. But it's one where we're sort of saying, yes, there is a distribution conversation. I think that the tax justice community can speak to, but how can we almost take a step back and have a pre-distribution conversation? Whereby tax is actually sort of chipping away at this current system, right? That's already undermining, the way in which we should be sort of living in a way that is sustainable on the planet.
Thank you so much, Chenai. It's been such an eye-opening conversation, and I'm really glad to have been able to meet you and talk to you about this topic. So thank you so much.
Yeah, me too. I want to say thank you for making this interesting topic even more interesting, and maybe outside of the nerd community even.
No, thank you so much for the invitation. This was a lot of fun. I appreciate the invitation.
So we touched upon many subjects that I thought that could be interesting to delve into a bit deeper. For example, this thing about tax avoidance and the impacts that have.
Yeah, I think it was just so staggering to hear the statistics. I mean, $90 billion annually lost in tax avoidance. And I think this is something that we don't think a lot about when we're talking about wealth tax, and the social impact of avoidance of wealth tax, and just how much good could be happening with that money. We're talking all the time about struggling to get nations together to provide enough money for climate adaptation and mitigation. Yet, Chenai mentioned that the loss to tax evasion each year is double the amount coming in for aid. So it just seems like such a huge lost opportunity for that to be having such an impact.
I agree, and I just came back from the global meeting on biodiversity that the UN had recently. And there we had a big fight about the 20 billion the rich countries should pay. And here Africa alone loses 90 billion a year.
It's mind-blowing.
So like, okay, we are not able to even pay 20, but we are able to steal 90 and there's no discussion about it. I think that's scandalous, actually.
Yes, I think it really builds on this kind of, you hear a lot in these spaces that there's a scarcity of funds, that we don't have enough funds for climate adaptation and mitigation, or that climate adaptation and mitigation is too expensive. And I think this is really revealing of the kind of interests that are at play when we're talking about money, and also how we frame how much things cost. When you start getting into the millions and billions, I think it's very hard for the everyday person to really like understand how big we're talking and also how small we're talking, because it's, as you say, it's very hard to raise 20 billion. And that sounds really big. That sounds really big. A lot of us can't really fathom what $20 billion is. But when you compare that to the staggering 90 billion, you really see that the wealthy are playing a little game here, because there's such a wide discrepancy between what we're told is available and what is actually being kind of squirreled away elsewhere.
However, it becomes extremely concrete for every single mum on the planet, or every retired person with a low pension, when they go to the food shop and they have to pay taxes and they have little money left at the end of the month. Then it becomes extremely clear who is paying these taxes if the rich avoid them. So that's where the clarity is. That's where the figures are. That's where you lose your 10 euros, your $10, or whatever currency you have where you live, because that is where you feel the impact. You would have had that money. You could have afforded that food. You could have paid your rent. You could have paid your electricity bill if this extremely rich people actually pay their taxes. That's where you feel it, but you don't do the connection.
Yeah. And I think this links to the question that we had about how this involves the individual person, because it affects our daily lives, but it's just been made invisible. And we don't see how our daily lives are impacted by this issue. I feel in ways, whether consciously or subconsciously, it's intentional. It's intentional to make us feel disconnected from the ways in which our economic politics are tied to the economic politics of the wealthy. And to understand that we are connected, and that we could be living more kind of easeful and abundant lives were people to take on more responsibility given their kind of social standing and their wealth. And so I think it becomes very important for us to understand how wealth is distributed, or how it's evaded, and work towards campaigning for these shifts in policy and in action.
I also liked a lot her reply on pre-distribution versus redistribution. That actually a change in tax policy could be the first step to tackle also the fact of pre-distribution is lacking in today's economy. I think that was also an interesting perspective. We should like tone down the conflict between these two goals and see it as part of achieving a bigger goal.
It's kind of like moving in the opposite direction to finally meet. It's like taking both ends of the system and shifting them and reimagining them. And I think this is, again, a common misconception within the climate space and with social change more and systems change more broadly, is that we feel that there has to be a one silver bullet solution, where we're going to need action from so many different perspectives. So we need everyone, everywhere, in every industry, using a wide variety of solutions to tackle these issues. And as Chenai said, the way that tax is distributed, the way that monies from wealthier nations is put to use for adaptation and mitigation will change, will be different, and will be specific in different contexts. And it's about being able to bring those different contexts and different approaches together and reducing the tension, because we all at the end have the same goals in mind.
Also, we talked a lot about the top level, how the United Nations and countries could change things. But I think a lot of it also starts with communities getting together, like focusing on cooperation and community, because we won't win at the UN level alone. We won't win at IMF or any kind of global body. We need local communities to empower themselves and fight back. And take back also economic and political power. So that's where 1,000 drops, digs through the stone also. So 1,000 paper cuts and 1,000 drops will have, a good run here.
100%. And I mean, you were talking about the impact of tax on everyday working people. And I think this is where mutual aid becomes such an important practice for us as communities. That's the tangible thing we can do as communities whilst we're fighting at the UN level, whilst we're fighting for policy change, to ease the economic burden that we feel is being in mutual relationship with each other, and removing those barriers that make us feel like we're alone or that we should hold our economic stresses alone, and more so connecting, which really the capitalist system of this late stage capitalist idea of individuality, you make it on your own, you fail on your own, you succeed on your own, by kind of investing in mutual aid, investing in community support, financially as well as non-financially, we resist some of those systems and start remaking the system in our own small ways, in our own small communities. And I think that's something tangible that we can do.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, every country is focused so much on competitiveness, outperforming another country, often with unhealthy tax cut or environmental legislations, or pitting people against people, while we here would focus on cooperativeness, the power of cooperativeness more. I think that is a word we should use more.
I work in technology, and a huge issue we're seeing now is that our rampant consumption of technology is fueling huge human rights crises, conflict, oppression in many places, including the Congo, which I think the statistic is exports 60% of the world's cobalt. I'm interested in how we can avoid these human rights abuses, or alleviate them, plus alleviate the environmental issues that are imposed by these kind of rampant mineral extraction through tax. I don't know whether you have any ideas about this.
I mean, sure. And then also put this in an indigenous people perspective with prior and informed consent. I think this is also the human rights are lacking from the beginning here. But of course, tax income could help us deal with that and fund participation and fund local communities to fight back and develop also. So I think that's really important. And I remember one conversation I had with the Botswana leading politician. Botswana is a big mining nation, and they actually do have extraction tax. And then when I explained my country, Sweden's tax on 0.2%, of which 75% goes to the landowner, not the taxpayer. So it's almost nothing really. And this is a problem we don't only see in the global south. Also in the global north, we have mining corporations exploiting tax loopholes and extreme low tax policies in both Canada and Sweden and elsewhere. And many African countries tried not only to have mineral export taxes or fees and levies, but also some of them had added value promotion. So they don't want you to export the basic ore or the simplest product, but moving up the value chain. And so they had high taxes on the lowest level of refinery. And then the more it was, added value locally, the higher the tax. And this was really good policy to develop industry in those countries. But the EU really forced them to slash this policy, which was detrimental to both tax income and national development. So we deliberately killed a nascent industry here with our trade agreements. So these mineral export and export taxes in general to promote and protect business environments and building up clusters is really important. That's actually how many European nations, early industrialized nations, actually managed to do that. So you protect yourself from some part of the competition until you're ready to compete. And that's also exactly what Korea did. So I think not permitting African countries to have a tax policy that benefits their development is extremely harmful and colonial. And I think it's interesting that you mentioned this, as you said.
Yeah, I think this conversation really leads us to tax policy is linked to so many other policy, to all policy. And when you take, say, the Congo example, you start to pull apart the threads and see how everything is linked. I mean, people are in a position of desperation, of oppression, of need, deep need. And if there were the right tax mechanisms to provide better healthcare, better schooling for that redistribution of finance, they would not be led to these very unsafe situations in the first place. But at the same time, with these export taxes, the way in which the infrastructure around these mining operations and maybe the ownership, the bartering power that communities would have to fight back against these very extractive or colonial kind of methods would also be resisted. I'm just seeing so many kind of links with these different aspects of tax.
And on so many levels, because of course taxes could also be used to promote the circular economy, that we need less extraction, to promote business models that needs less consumerism, or a change in business models that would make sure that we reuse things, or longer life cycles of things. And so it's not only on the mineral tax side, but it's also, you could use taxes to, keep more of the local economy in place, less extraction, less destruction. It's really important that we can't continue a policy where we have trade agreements and taxes that undermine local community development and national development in other countries. I think that's appalling.
Yeah, and I think it's so part of the environmental justice approach to consider this and to consider the actual mechanisms that can be used to allow communities to resist oppressive systems and oppressive infrastructures. So I'm really glad we've been able to touch on this today.
Yeah, let's build rather than tear down communities.
Yeah. So to finish, we know that the super rich caused the climate crisis while still profiting from it. And in this episode, we've been talking about how we could tax them. We need to change the social narrative on this topic and push leaders of countries and of multinational corporations to act. We've heard a lot about tax justice and some of the solutions and approaches we can take.
Sure, because in a situation where the super rich both cause the climate crisis and profit from it, we need to fight back. And there are several things you can do, because we have been talking about what governments can do, but in this case, you can join the well-being movement by signing the Well-being for All petition. You can also listen to the Season 2 System Shift episode with Tove Maria Ryding on the tax convention. I can recommend that one as well. And also we have a blog where you can read about, the Greenpeace blog on global tax rules that work for the people. So there are a lot of things you can do.
Great. Sounds wonderful. I'll be getting into those resources too.
Of all the topics we talk about here in this podcast, tax change is 100% under human control, 100% possible to change very rapidly. So these are one of the few things we have been talking about here, which is really easy and possible to change fundamentally. The only thing lacking is the political will to benefit the planet rather than the super rich, to benefit people rather than the large corporations, and to benefit our mutual survival and our ecosystems rather than short-term profits.
Yeah, exactly. And this is, as you say, something that can happen in our lifetime and will happen if we all resist and if we continue to educate ourselves and engage in movements for tax reform and for alternative economic systems.
Perfect. Nobody is alone here. We need to move on this, and it's actually easier than many other struggles we can have.
Thanks for listening to this episode of System Shift. Join us next time when we're asking the question, are urban communities a remedy for loneliness? Subscribe to System Shift wherever you get your podcasts so you don't miss an episode.